Brothers and sisters, I have for you today a rare treat, thanks to a kind suggestion by my friend James. I'm going to give you a very direct look into the mind of a late 18th century composer whose music is largely forgotten these days, but was much celebrated during his lifetime. I speak of Antonio Salieri, born in the Republic of Venice in 1750, the year of Bach's death, died in Vienna in 1825, 2 years before Beethoven shuffled off his own mortal coil. Salieri spent the majority of his career and much of his life as Kapellmeister of Vienna's Imperial Chapel. He enjoyed great success as a composer of operas, and it was that pursuit that occupied him primarily. He also composed some orchestral music, including a handful of symphonies and a half-dozen concertos. The work we'll be exploring in this video is the first concerto he wrote, dating from 1770, a triple concerto for violin, oboe, cello, and orchestra. We'll be hearing a splendid recording by the Camerata Bern, with soloists Thomas Fury, Heinz Holliger, and Thomas de Menga, respectively. And instead of following an engraved published score, as usual in this series, you're going to enjoy Salieri's manuscript. A few words are in order about that manuscript. Let's spend a little time with page 1, beginning at the top left. The first two staves are occupied by music for the two horns, corny in D. The parts are transposed. I won't go into the history of that. So to reconcile them with the D major sounds coming from the rest of the orchestra, you'll have to imagine them a whole step higher than printed and then adjusted downward an octave. And these are horns in D, not trumpets in D. You'll likely notice that the horns are used sparingly, mostly as splashes of wind color in loud passages. Incidentally, they will sometimes be joined by timpani, not included in this score, but allowed for in the note in the upper left-hand corner of the page. The next two staves are occupied by the violins, violini, divided as firsts and seconds. Let me explain the shorthand that presents itself immediately. You can see that the first violins are playing a theme. You also see a pair of diagonal slashes on the second violin staff. This simply means that the seconds double the firsts in the playing of that music. No need to write it out twice. You'll encounter this shorthand often. Notice the scribbled treble clef signs at the beginning of the horn and violin staves, and compare it to the scribbled alto clef sign given for the violas. Underneath the viola staff lies the staff for the bassoon, fagotto, abbreviated in the margin. This instrument will often double the cellos and basses, and you will see a note to that effect. Incidentally, the orientation of the bass clef sign is to this day not an entirely settled matter, although most publications opt for the other option, the one that faces left. The next three staves are for the three soloists, violino, oboe, violoncello. Notice that the very first sound in this concerto comes from the solo violin, answered forthwith by the violins of the orchestra. This means that this concerto will not exemplify the more complex version of sonata form that features a double exposition, as became normative in works soon to follow. The bottom staff is marked basso, a singular noun, meaning a single, undifferentiated part to be played by both cellos and basses. Even though they play in apparent unison, the basses sound an octave lower than notated. Salieri will occasionally call for the basses to drop out and rejoin the cellos later. Interestingly enough, it is the basso staff that is marked with the tempo indication for the movement. I'm not sure why that is, but I do have a conjecture. In all probability, contemporary performances of this orchestral music would have included a harpsichordist, who would be following the bass line and realizing it with right-hand chords, perhaps assisted with some figures. That harpsichordist, perhaps Salieri himself, would play a role in the conducting of the orchestra. While we're getting accustomed to Salieri's manuscript, let's have a quick look at page 2. First, notice the abbreviations in the left margin. I think they're probably self-explanatory. Notice also that the composer did not bother to provide clef signs and key signatures. He's assuming that even amateur players would retain that information as they left the first page. In case the shorthand in the first violin line is unfamiliar to you, I'm talking about the double slashes through note stems. They simply mean divide the note of whatever value into 16th notes, all at the same notated pitch. Two other things, then we'll move on. You can see that halfway through the second measure of this page, the solo oboe enters, paired with the violas, playing the same music that the solo violin, paired with orchestral violins, provided at the beginning of the movement, but at a different pitch level. Salieri is presenting his first theme as a double fugue, and the oboe and violas are playing the first answer at the dominant pitch level. The fugue continues with a second answer and then a kind of stretto. That happens only in the exposition. During the recap, the theme is simply stated as such, but in the somewhat surprising key of G major, and worked out quite a bit differently, and then the movement proceeds as we would expect in sonata form. The other thing I'll need to mention is the half measure at the end of this page. It will be completed after the page turn. That will happen often in this movement. Let's have a quick look at this page from the second thematic group. If you can retain the clef signs and key signatures in your memory, you'll see right away that this music is in A major, as one would expect of a sonata form movement. There is a 4-beat passage of music spanning the first two measures, mid-bar to mid-bar, that is repeated. You can see this most easily in the solo violin part. You can also see another 4-beat repeat coming at the end of the page, with the music shifted now to the bar lines. There will be some fast page turning when that comes around, and it will also happen again during the recap. One final thing before we launch into the movements individually. This movement is provided with the standard cadenza opportunity, namely a short passage for full orchestra called a cadenza ritornello, that culminates in a held second inversion tonic chord. It is expected that the soloists will provide their own cadenza, according to their talents and tastes, and of course with whatever cooperation is necessary to pull it off. The cadenza you will hear in this case was obviously written out and rehearsed, and just as obviously a committee effort. The score you're looking at is the last page of Movement 1, and the first chord of the first measure, a held half note, is that culminating 6/4 chord of the cadenza ritornello I just described. The cadenza that follows is, in a sense, an elaboration of that predominant chord. The second half note of that measure, the one with the trill indication in the violin and oboe parts, is the dominant chord that resolves the 6/4 chord, and the downbeat that follows that resolves the dominant chord into the movement's coda. Salieri's music sometimes gets a bad rap because people insist on comparing it to Mozart's, and that probably has something to do with that film. I think that's a mistake. Let me describe the first movement to you and see if I can help you hear this music for what it is. It's in galant style, a style often associated with C.P.E. Bach, and an excellent specimen of which can be heard in Haydn's C major cello concerto. Its beat standard is quite broad, so it will not be unusual to encounter a lot of 30-second notes. It's music that's extremely clearly defined, formally speaking, with no attempt made at any point to obscure formal divisions. I'm not even going to furnish a written commentary because I really doubt it's necessary. The first theme area is in D major, the second in A, including some haunting A minor music, the development modulating, and the return of the theme, the first theme in the subdominant key, as noted earlier, then returning to D major for a complete restatement of all the second theme material in the tonic key. Incidentally, Franz Schubert, who studied with Salieri, often made use of this recapitulatory device. The cadenza is the icing on the cake, and the coda is unpretentious. Whatever Salieri intended to say has been said. Movement 2 is in the concerto's warmer subdominant key, G major. The stylistic marking cantabile suggests a tempo even broader than that of the first movement. The hornists have been instructed to take up shorter instruments in G. To relate what they're playing to the rest of the orchestra, read their parts a perfect fourth lower. For instance, their opening long C in octaves is actually a G in octaves, a fourth lower. This sonatiform movement actually does have a modest double exposition, and the development's beginning overlaps the final chords of the closing for a more nearly seamless effect. That closing, by the way, seems to foreshadow an equally syncopated variation in the final movement. The same provision is made in this movement for a cadenza as in the first. The concerto returns to the tonic key for its variations form finale. The tema, or theme for varying, is set in 2 repeated 8-bar strains, which constitute a double period. There are 7 variations, all of which hew faithfully, I want to say tenaciously, to the same formal and harmonic rubric. A few call for some comment. One is the second variation, featuring the solo cello doubled by the orchestra's first violins playing pianissimo, relentlessly syncopated. We noted a foretaste of this strange and somehow hilarious variation in the first movement's closing sections. You'll want to notice how Salieri handled the first and second endings during the virtuoso cello variation. It's a somewhat vertical solution. The variation that follows, the 6th, the violin solo with those death-defying virtuosic octave displacements, obviously represents Salieri's second thoughts on the matter. You might enjoy comparing the original scratched-out version with the revision. The 7th variation is a double variation, that is, the repeats are written out. This variation alternates between the martial and the coquettish, and the whole movement, and with it the whole work, is brought to its conclusion by a brief and strangely unbalanced coda.